Hello and welcome back to the Thematic Intelligence Podcast. At Global Data's Thematic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Alex Blair, and today I'll be speaking with Doug Weir, who's the director at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, or CEOBS. We'll discuss the much underreported military emissions gap, as well as the environmental impact of the Russia-Ukraine and Middle Eastern conflicts. Doug, thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Now, much of CEOBS' work is centered around the concept of a military emissions gap, correct? Now, what exactly is this, and how does it tie in with what CEOBS does?
Okay, so part of our work has always been looking at the environmental impact of military activities, as well as the environmental impact of armed conflicts as well. And a few years ago, we began looking at this question of greenhouse gas emissions from militaries. And the more we looked, the less we found. And there just wasn't enough material out there. Things hadn't really been done in a comprehensive way. So it was kind of clear to us that we needed something more comprehensive to try and pull together the few little threads of data that were available to try and get a handle on how big this contribution that militaries were making to the climate crisis is. So we teamed up with colleagues at Scientists for Global Responsibility, NGO based up in Lancaster in the UK, and also with Lancaster University, Durham University. So it was a kind of a collective approach of civil society and academia. And one of the things we did initially was to look at what our military is reporting to the UNFCCC. So obviously states have to report their emissions data to the UNFCCC every year. But it turned out that the guidance for what should be reported for militaries was pretty vague, and actually it's entirely voluntary within the Paris Agreement. And this problem kind of dates back to the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, when the US pushed for military reporting and military emissions to be exempted from the wider reporting under the agreement. And it also speaks to a wider issue around militaries and the environment. That you have this sense of environmental exceptionalism, that the standards don't apply to them because of what they do is somehow exceptional to other sections of society, which, there are arguments either way, but doesn't really hold up, particularly when it comes to emissions reporting. So one of our initial things we did, which we launched at COP26, was to launch this website, militaryemissionsgap.org, and that had an interactive map which allowed people to look at what their countries were currently reporting and what we thought the standard of that reporting was. Turns out, there were like 4 countries who were just about reporting in line with the standards of the IPCC, and we looked at 60-odd countries which were those with the highest 60 military expenditures.
And down the avenue of the COP angle, CEOBS members of your team were in Dubai at COP28 recently. Now, to what extent were military emissions discussed, and how was the conversation broached?
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch it develop over the last 3 COPs. So obviously we launched at COP26 up in Glasgow, 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh. There was not a great deal of attention or interest this time round because you had that parallel conflict in Gaza. You had a lot more attention on emissions from conflict in particular. I guess one of the difficult kind of juxtaposition is, while there is increasing interest and attention from civil society actors around this relationship between conflict and emissions, it's not on the formal agenda anywhere within COP. What we had at the last COP was quite welcome addition in UNEP's flagship emissions gap report for a mention of military emissions for the first time. It was only a paragraph within this wider report, but this has been part of the problem, that because this whole topic has been excluded from UNFCCC process, all the kind of climate community, the kind of NGOs, the monitors, they look at industrial emissions, agricultural emissions, all these other sources, but not military sources. So it's not just a gap because militaries aren't reporting this stuff. It's also the wider climate community isn't engaging with it or hasn't engaged with it. And part of the reason is because the data is just not there. So you can't really talk in meaningful ways about the scale of the gap because the data is not there. So it's kind of a chicken and egg issue in some respects. But I think what we've seen in the last few COPs is this growing interest and attention. And part of that is on conflict emissions and part of that is on military emissions as well.
And now a lot of the resistance to this military emissions reporting has been centered around security justifications, with some analysts, defense companies, military personnel saying that detailed emissions data could be leveraged by hostile actors, hostile bodies to undermine security, let's say, in specific regions. Do you think their concerns bear any weight?
It's interesting. We've just actually just published a piece on that today because it is a refrain. There are a few states who, in their submissions to the NFCCC, say we're not going to give you this fuel use data because of national security considerations. But the reality is, when you look at the kinds of data that are available on militaries, whether it's contracts and spending, whether it's force disposition and size, whether it's live aircraft and marine traffic tracking systems. There are so many other military data sets which are available in the public domain and which I suspect probably pose a far greater threat to national security than fuel use data will. And so, yeah, I think these arguments are pretty specious. And I think part of the problem is that the militaries have not been required to do this stuff. And so they are quite far behind the curve. So for quite a lot of them, they don't necessarily have this data or the infrastructure to be able to report on it in a meaningful way. We're seeing that change quite quickly. There are some who are a lot better than others. US, UK, Germany, Norway, they're pretty good and pretty transparent in their data. It still needs work, but yeah, compared to others. So if these very large, influential military spenders can do this stuff, then there's no real reason that others can't and shouldn't. And I think what's really vitally important is that we have this global standard and level playing field for emissions reporting to the UNFCCC.
And not to mention the obviously threat to national security posed by climate change itself, which is astronomical. Let's transition over to the environmental impact of two major ongoing conflicts, one of which you touched on. Now, researchers have estimated that the emissions from the first 18 months, approximately, of the Russia-Ukraine war have totaled more than 150 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, that's more than the annual emissions of a highly industrialized country like Belgium. For example, what ecological damage has Russia's invasion and subsequent war in Ukraine had on the actual land itself?
Yeah, I think so. We've been monitoring and we are still monitoring the impacts in Ukraine. We've been working with different international organizations to support their work. We have this instant database where we're conducting remote environmental assessments of environmentally damaging incidents. So we've been tracking a whole suite of environmental issues. So I guess in terms of maybe contextualizing the damage, it's important to consider a few things. So one is the length of the front line and the nature of the conflict, that you have this high intensive use of explosive force. And then you have the issues around Ukraine itself. So obviously it's a highly industrialized country, a lot of legacy industrial sites, a number of which have also been targeted, whether on the front line or remotely. You also have the issues around nuclear power plants of what we've seen at Chernobyl and the ongoing occupation of Zaporizhia. So you have this very high profile environmental incidents and damage. So we've seen a huge range of damaging incidents, from the devastation of towns and cities with explosive force, which then has a whole range of issues from conflict debris and air quality issues to surface runoff and pollution, to the damage and disruption to agricultural land from explosive weapons use, intensive use of mines, but also fortifications and earthworks. We had issues on water courses and water bodies from damage to water treatment plants or industrial pollution. You've had a number of sites where it's not just been a case of an industrial facility being damaged, but the industrial facility has been the focus of the conflict. So the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, for example, which was devastated for months on end of Russian attacks. You also have places like oil refineries like Lysychansk, where this has been part of the front line. So you've had these potentially environmentally risky sites which have been caught up in the conflict. In addition, you have sort of these knock-on issues around environmental governance and control. So obviously large parts of Ukraine are under occupation. It's not entirely clear how quite valuable ecosystems are being managed. We know at least one sensitive wetland has been turned into a military firing range by Russia, for example. So there's this whole suite of environmental problems, both within Ukraine, but also reverberating issues as well for the region and globally.
Final question, Doug. Now, at the time of recording, it's 4 months to the day since the Hamas attack on October 7th and the subsequent Israeli bombardment of Palestine. Now, I imagine the research is very much ongoing, but what can you tell us about the magnitude of environmental damage in Palestine, Israel, and the wider Middle East?
I suppose the first thing to consider is that this hasn't been the first conflict in Gaza. And obviously the nature of the occupation itself has had very serious environmental consequences for the land as well as for people living in Gaza. And so you had this, what's essentially a very degraded strip of land where you had a lot of pressure on water resources, on the aquifer. You had pre-existing salinization of the aquifer, for example. You had solid waste issues. You had a whole suite of environmental problems which had been caused or exacerbated by recurring periods of conflict, but also the occupation and blockade itself. Now, since October, layered on top of this, you have these massive levels of physical damage from the intensive use of explosive force. it's been devastating for urban areas, and also for the infrastructure that supports it, whether it's water infrastructure, waste infrastructure. There are huge question marks as to what comes next. There were already concerns about Gaza being a livable place by 2020. It was kind of a report that came out in 2012 or so because of this ongoing environmental stress. So the question now is, what next? How are we going to recover from this? At what point is the conflict going to stop? What are these new issues like pumping seawater into Hamas's tunnels? What impact is that going to have on groundwater resources, on soil quality? You've seen apparently deliberate damage of agricultural areas around the Gaza Strip, which were vital for livelihoods. So the environment within this area has just been, completely devastated and gets more devastated as the days go on. So there are huge question marks over what this means for the long-term viability of communities within Gaza.
Absolutely. It's a massively under-discussed topic that I expect will increasingly become part of the environmental and military agenda. Doug, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for your time today. It was really insightful.
You're welcome. Good to speak to you.
And thanks to you all for listening from us in Thematic Intelligence. See you next time.